Okay, so we're live. So welcome to the first Node.js community package maintenance team meeting. We were just starting to talk a bit about the process for the meetings themselves. And so we'll just carry back on that. As I was just outlining, we follow, the typical agenda has the announcements, things that were tagged with package maintenance agenda from across the project, question and answer, for anybody who's watching on the YouTube stream. So what do people think in terms of that, following that approach for our meeting process? Does that sound good, or do people have alternate suggestions or thoughts? I guess again, I'll assume silence is an okay unless somebody speaks up. Okay, so we'll do that. Of course, we can always adjust as we go along. Agreed. So I'm just going to take a quick note. Follow usual Node.js. Okay, so the next thing I had on the agenda was to discuss a recurring meeting time. At least in my experience, it works much better if we have a fixed time or times that we can meet on a regular basis than trying to schedule one each time. So the question is how do we choose that recurring meeting time? I might suggest that since this turned out to be a good time for a good number of participants, maybe we choose this as a starting point. But because we also know that there were a number of people who couldn't make this time, and we do have people across the world, we might want to choose another team time which is more favorable for people who can't make it to this particular time, and then alternate between those two different times. The other thought I do have is we'll likely, given the number of people that showed interest, need to break out into smaller groups as well. So we might adjust based on that later on. But, maybe to start with, we could choose two times if that makes sense to people. Does anybody object to choosing this time as one of those two?
Yeah, this time's good. I think having two different meetings for different time zones is a good idea.
I think one in a more favorably time zone will be very much appreciated from this end.
Right. So is that like I always think in Eastern, but like that's like 9 o'clock Eastern, or it's obviously for Europe, it's before 5 or 6 o'clock at night, right?
Yeah, but that would be fine, I think.
What I'd suggest is I can open a second doodle, which has time slots, which are, in a time that's not this one. And we can see how that plays out to select the second one. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to say Michael will open a second doodle to choose a second time slot in a different.
I think having a meeting that more friendly to the other side of the world would be nice. And I wonder who would host that one, though.
It depends what time slot that is and how far off it is. Like if it's, say, 8 or 9 Eastern, which is about 7-8 hours earlier than this, I can still host that. If it's earlier than that, then I'd look for somebody else. I think Matteo is in that time zone, so he's probably more available to do something earlier, right?
Yeah, count on me if I'm not traveling all around the globe, whatever. If I'm not,
right.
If I'm not somewhere else, if I'm at home, yes, absolutely.
Okay, we can probably also ask for other volunteers as well. So
one thing we should probably try and do is make sure that in the two different meeting times, there's as much overlap as possible so that we don't kind of have two separate groups discussing things past each other. So there might be a time that's best for like other parts of the world that makes it really hard for the people in this time zone and this time slot to join in, and we should try and maximize that overlap.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So yeah, I'll try and choose a few different ones in the doodle to see if we can pull that information out. Favors a different. Okay. I think what we ended up on the TSC for Node.js was we have one at, I think it's 8 a.m. Eastern. It's current 11 Eastern and 5 Eastern, which were the three. And so maybe I'll try the this match is close to one of them. I'll see if either of the other two ones seem to work out for people. Okay, so I think unless anybody else has something to add on that topic, we can move to the next one. Okay, so the next one is the meat of the meeting, where I'd outlined a few initial goals that I had in mind, but I think it's worth spending time to see if people have additional goals that we should add to that list, and then sort of go through each of them and figure out, okay, what's the first step on those? Do we have volunteers to start pushing them forward, and so forth? So I guess the first question would be, the four ones that I listed out are there, but do people have others that they think we should add into an initial set that we should be looking at to start? So far we have, sort of defining and documenting how we prioritize what we think are key packages. The second one is building and documenting guidance, tools, and processes that businesses can identify to figure out what they depend on and understand, how and why they should help contribute to those packages because of that dependence. The third one was documenting a backlog and providing resources to help businesses identify how their developers can ramp up and get engaged. So basically that's, trying to not necessarily take on all of that work, but enable people to volunteer and get involved in that work. And finally, the fourth one was building and documenting and evangelizing guidance, tools, and processes that make it easier for maintainers to manage multiple streams and accept help from those who depend on the module. And I think, the recent example of, part of that, a good practice that makes sense is how you hand off modules to other people when you want to do that, right? So, but there's this sort of that broader area of like, okay, we should have a whole library, if we can, of best practices that help people, so you don't have to figure it out on your own. And and if you want to take advantage of that, you can. So those were the four. Do people have things they'd like us to add before we dive into any one of those? I think Glenn's got his hand up.
Yeah, so I've been trying to help in any way I can for perhaps a couple of years. And I think the biggest problem I think that's had is the job you're doing, the management of this, but also the onboarding process. I think that comes under the splitting into subgroups, because although I'm willing to do almost anything to help it, I mean, this is putting my kids through college and all I do is Node all day long. There is often not a process for bringing somebody on board. Yeah, I can build it. Yes, so what? Yeah, you've got instructions for that. But as soon as you get beyond that, simple things like you wanted help with Jenkins builds, other things, there doesn't seem to be like the onboarding process, and nobody seems to have time. And I think that's actually the real problem you have. You may agree or disagree, but that's my 2 cents worth.
Right. So, okay. So onboarding, you mean to this team or to Node itself, or?
Well, for this team, I would expect it to be the same problems that I've seen at other places where they've asked for help and somebody puts their hand up and say, I am willing to help, but there's no way to bridge the gap between coming in from outside and the current maintainers of any part of the Node infrastructure. There's a big gap, and what there needs to be is some sort of hand-holding, like this is the way we do it. I'll stop there because there's enough people on the call, but I think that's probably an issue already.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of how to write that down. So onboarding to enable people help out with this effort. Yeah, because I think that certainly goes across a number of ways and modules, because not just really how to enable them directly to join this team, but how to enable them to say, how do you join and help out with a module that we've identified as being one of the key modules, for example? And how to, so the whole onboarding process of how to get engaged in this work to help out to get engaged. Okay, so I've got that as a fifth one.
To me, that actually seems like a sub-bullet point of the resources for documenting processes, right? Because that's really just a process that any module ecosystem would need to have a good foundation for, right? Onboarding new participants. Is that maybe not just a subset of providing that kind of docs to everyone?
Yeah, I think you're right in that it fits under, but I think it fits under other ones as well. So like it definitely, one piece would be the how do you help maintainers sort of accept help, and there could be a standard practice for that. I think that it might fit also though under like documenting the backlog. So if we actually build the backlog and you say, okay, these are the things we think are important as a team to be worked on, but this team isn't going to be able to do all that work. So how do we onboard people to help? They don't necessarily have to come and participate in the work of, setting up the processes, but we also want people who are just going to say, well, I've got cycles to help with that particular module. How do we onboard them so that they're engaged and know what to do? And, and it's kind of related as well to the business one where it's like, okay, businesses, how do we get them engaged to say to their people, hey, yes, you have time to go work on this. But I think calling it out as something on its own, just so we don't forget about it across all of them, probably makes some sense in my mind. LJ Harp's got his hand up.
Yeah, I feel like having seen the flurry of activity on the GitHub repo, I feel like there's kind of two main things we need to address before we really can achieve anything. The first one is there's a lot of people that have signed up to join, and you've kind of mentioned this a little bit, but like I think that at some point there's too many people to have a productive meeting. And so while it's awesome that we get as many people as possible to help with whatever they can help with, that's not the same thing as wanting as many people as possible in the regular meetings and making decisions. So it might be useful to maybe create, like in the modules group, we have this observer category and this member category. The intention is both for inactive, so members to be the voting people and inactive members go down to observable, but also so that if you don't have time, you can still participate as an observer and still participate in consensus, but more like we don't have to hold up decisions on getting a quorum amongst the observers. And so maybe not that exact structure, but something similar here where we kind of divide up like people who are interested in helping with overall group management versus people who are available to help for specific initiatives, which may or may not be identified yet. And that might help kind of manage this so we don't have like 100 people in the group and we can't ever make any progress. So I feel like that's the first issue, is just kind of figuring out how to manage membership. And then the second issue, I think, is deciding. There's a lot of things that package maintenance can mean to a lot of us, a lot of things. And it's so much that not only will we never get it all done, but we won't get it all done in the near future. And so I think it might be useful if we decided what is not in our scope in the first phase. Meaning for example, while I think we should recommend things to NPM to add that then Node could support, we might want to decide, yes, we're going to focus first on making recommendations to NPM, or we might decide, let's not focus on that now. And that can help us triage as people file a bunch of suggestions about that are really NPM problems, like either we say, great, that's part of that initiative, or we say, thanks, let's save that for later. And then similarly for all the other things. And like for, you know, an initiative about creating a guide of best practices is very different than an initiative about let's create a, you know, a way to handle maintaining specific packages that pop up. And like, those are very different things. And I feel like personally, I feel like we shouldn't be in the business of taking ownership of a package or orchestrating maintainership of a package until we have a agreed upon and publicized and generally accepted by the community list or guide as to what those best practices are. In other words, I don't think we should try to follow practices we haven't established yet. But like, that's my personal opinion, and we can decide as a group if that's the order we want to do it in. But I think deciding that order is very important.
Right. So like
because there's already, yeah, go ahead.
I was saying in that case, you're suggesting we like define the best practices.
Yes.
And then once we've done that, then look at, well, what can we do to help people adopt them, right?
Right. Like identify, you know, it might be useful to identify the problems instead of and explicitly focus on no solutions are to be suggested. Just identify the problems and let's agree on the problems. What's hard? And, you know, and then we can say, what problems do we want to solve? And then we can look at those problems and say, can they be solved? Can they be solved by just Node, or do they need NPM's involvement? You know, like there's a lot of ways we can go about it. And I don't really have a huge opinion as to what the best way is, but the current flurry of activity on the repo is, I don't think, conducive to making any progress anywhere. And we have to find a way to focus that, because programmers, JavaScript programmers, and humans in general have lots of opinions, and we have to find a way to narrow those down in a way that makes people feel like their opinions are still wanted, even if they're temporarily not relevant or temporarily not useful.
Right. Yeah, no, I'd agree that, like, you know, we want to, as a group, go together and say, okay, you know, if these are the things that, you know, say the long-term things we want to get to, what are the things, the concrete next steps we want to do in the next month, for example, right? And then make sure we have volunteers to tackle those, and then publicize those. So you're right, you know, so it's great to have lots of suggestions, but we need to have some focus on. And that's where I was thinking, you know, hopefully we can look at what these these initial areas were, and any other ones that we think should be the starting points. Pick one or two of them, and you know, or if we have enough people to break off into smaller groups, as many as that makes sense, and then say, okay, for each of those, what are the key things that we, you know, what do we do for each of those to get it kicked off, and then starting more with, I think, like you said, what are some of the problems and how are we going to try and solve them? So I'm looking, I don't see anybody people's hands up. If you haven't used Zoom before, there is a button where you can raise your hand if you want to talk. So we'll try and keep our eye open for that.
I can't.
And you can't because I made you a co-host.
Yeah. So I have just one thing to note. In theory, there should be a lot less contention and a lot less number of objections here compared to the way the modules team has been working so far. And there is no, I wouldn't track, like, I would have a way less, I would more open and more node type of, like, lazy consensus and things like that, compared to how the modules team has been run, mainly because there is, like, the amount of issues that were brought into the modules team were actually, like, significant, and it was built as a way to create a venue for different people to talk and express the different opinion and try to see and produce something, because there was, like, different opinions being blocking progress in any form. However, I think in this specific case, there is I don't expect there is so much of contention, but there is a lot of work to do. So I would prefer to follow the usual pattern of, does anybody object? and keep things going. Having said that, I would prefer a slightly different approach to what Jordan has proposed, which is to actually find out from friendlies where there is areas, there are problematic areas, problematic modules that need some help and maintenance. And when I mean friendlies, I mean like people that are close to, or can be, or either are node collaborators or are close to node.js, and that we can use to test our assumptions and test our processes against. So that, you know, I am good in defining those processes, but I'm also good in saying, I would like to have the, like, let's see, let's do not develop these processes in isolation and then test them out, but more of an iterative approach where we go slowly in the sense that we have like one project and then we define some ground rules, then we go and pilot a project, then we iterate we iterate on this rather than we do, we think a lot before doing, but I will follow more, let's learn how to do this as we go because we have no clue. So I have my own opinion and being a highly impactful NPM author, but I'm not the biggest one in any form, in one sense, and in the other sense, I have no time. So I have a ton of modules that are being neglected and get no maintenance. So this is more or less my that's more or less my suggestion. But we can probably reach out to Dominic Tarr or Matthias Boos or a lot of other people that are definitely helpful and would really be glad to receive some help in some of their modules. So that's kind of the situation where that's kind of my proposal in that regard. And then we extend it to modules that we are not that are authored by people that we do not know. Okay, that is my original.
Right, now I see Joel has his hand up, so.
I would just want to reply to Matteo real quick.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify, I wasn't saying that we should do nothing until we have thought out everything, more suggesting that we shouldn't do anything that we haven't thought about at all as a group. So like if we can do little things at a time and test them out in packages for sure. But I think we also, like, if we find a technique that works for some, but does not work for many or for any, then we may need to be careful how we test that out and endorse it. That's all.
Okay, Joel, you have your hand up?
Yeah. Hey, so we consume a lot of packages at Walmart, and usually I tell my teams to make sure that they maintain their package log file. And this most recent event stream thing was quite a stir for us. And I think to tackle the root cause of what happened is that we may want to maintain a list of like high traffic modules, and we want to help out owners out there who have their hands full, and so we provide something such as like a list of modules that the owner wants to transfer over, and then we may want to help build up a network of people who are interested, and they can get people like that we already know to vouch for them. Say, I know this person personally, and then once a package is transfer ownership, then we keep those packages on a high watch list, so then we can monitor some of those packages.
Right, I think that kind of fits into we all seem to, or at least I think we know that there's a good number of modules that are kind of key for the ecosystem. But the first step is kind of like, how do we identify what those are? And if we then had those identified and could figure out which ones were at risk or needed help, we could reach out to ones, as Matteo says, who are potentially friendly, because we know the package maintainers are, part of the node community or closely related, to start testing out ideas and stuff like that. But the first thing is to really decide how we would prioritize, how do we identify modules that we think are ones that we should get engaged with?
Yeah, so I think just looking at NPM's download numbers, and second is we should identify critical applications, like anything that's to do with, say, Electron and VS Code editor, like more of some of the popular apps out there, and we identify the package they use. So we create this initial list based on some of these criteria we want to pick, and then we maintain a list of modules that authors want to look for people to transfer over, and we facilitate that transfer process.
Just to back up a second, sorry, coming in.
Yep.
I don't know if I have to raise my hand or not. And try and apply some of the approach that LJ Hart was saying, what are the problems we're trying to solve, identify. I'm not certain I understand why we need to create a list of really popular and key packages, because I'm not sure what comes after that. What is the problem we're trying to solve for those packages? Is it because they don't have the resources to continue maintaining? One of the things I'm worried about, and I think I commented about this in the GitHub issue, was we can create a marketplace or sort of like a pool of resources where people are willing to help each other maintain packages. But I think the actual problem that we are all kind of reeling from right now with Event Stream is that there was another maintainer who wanted to step up. It's just that they weren't trustworthy in maintaining it. And us creating a pool of resources of people who are willing to help each other maintain packages doesn't really solve this problem of how do we deal with trust in terms of when those packages are handed off from one another. So I think before we jump into let's build a model for what important ecosystem packages are, I think we should try and figure out what we would do with that information.
Agreed. I think
I'm going to let, I think it was, I'm looking at hands who are raised. So Joel has his hand raised again.
Sorry, I don't have a hand raised button.
I haven't lowered my hand, but so yeah, was just the simple thing I want to make is that we want to create initial list of packages that we are interested in, looking for at popular apps, looking at NPM downloads, and we want to help out with authors at the transfer process. So then we know if any package has recently transferred, then we would add those to keep an eye on these for a while kind of thing, until at some point we decide that it's okay, this is safe and we can leave it. So that's the points I want to make.
Okay, and was it LJ who was, or Wes who was?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I don't have a hand raised button. I'm not sure why.
Okay.
My UI doesn't show it. It showed it at first when I joined, but it no longer does. First, on the trust thing, I think that I think that's a really slippery problem for us to try to solve, because even if we have a list of modules and we know what we want to do with them, figuring out who can help in what situations is still a problem. I don't think there's anything we can effectively do other than having a popularity contest of saying people we know or people who contribute to Node Core, which is just not going to scale. I don't think there's a really good way for us to manage that. So I think a more effective approach would be to try to define processes to notify users of changes, not necessarily actually handing it over, not managing trust and all this stuff, but coming up with a way to maintain that list of recently changed packages or something like that would help users make decisions on their own, right? Like us making decisions on who gets it and who can help just is really not an effective thing long run. But I think if we had, email lists of, I'm watching this package and I want to see when it changes hands, that I think would be a lot more scalable, a lot more effective as we grow.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of best practices of what you should do when you do hand over a module or whatever. And if there's some things that we can say, like, these are some things you should think about when you do that or whatever, that could be the kind of helpful thing, so that at least if you're a package owner and you do that, you can at least feel comfortable you've done, something reasonable, right? Without having to figure out what something reasonable is yourself, which is sometimes quite difficult. I think it's still sort of, we kind of loop back to the question of what do we want to get started on. Let me just see if anybody else has their hand up first. Or since it doesn't seem to be universally, I see Benjamin has his hand up.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, this is my first time joining, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah, I think from the goals that were stated, there wasn't anything specifically addressing the security aspect out of those goals outlined. There's just goals focused on improving maintenance. And the event stream package, I think, is, well, from the outside perspective, it seems to be what caused this group to be created, which is trying to figure out ways to prevent something like that from happening again. And I've gone through and I've just done a few notes. So for me, trying to figure out what problems actually need to be solved here, then it seems like, okay, well, there's improved maintenance, so node upgrades happen quicker and package versions upgrade quicker, leaving less old versions exposed. Improved maintenance processes that ease the burden, so more packages are maintained. But then there's also the security ones, which is prevent attack vectors of unmaintained packages being exploited from accidental security vulnerabilities. So the attack vector there would be outdated dependencies. But there's also like prevent attack vectors from popular packages being exploited from intentional security vulnerabilities. So what are these vectors? So it could be a malicious dependency or a malicious actor. And then how do we reduce the damage of these attack vectors? Because I think like a lot of the statement in the goals is just how to improve the management process, help maintainers reduce the burden of maintenance. But there isn't anything particularly there on how do we react when there was a malicious intent or a bad actor, and how do we prevent the vectors that would cause, or how do we reduce the damage of a malicious package, or how do we reduce the incentive of creating a malicious package. So I think like having that in the goals, like the security concerns, or what specifically are problems that we're trying to tackle, and what solutions, so we can have like things we can check off with a checklist rather than just something we can continuously continue to improve.
Right. So just some background. I actually was having this discussion with a number of people long before that incident. So it wasn't formed in response to that particular security issue, but I do agree that having like a specific goal of improving security for the ecosystem directly called out probably makes sense. So I've added that into the list there. I see Edgar has his hand raised.
Yeah. So in terms of being aware of what the vectors are that problems are entering, so do we have some sort of a dashboard or some kind of logging system set up where we can all kind of go in and start to observe patterns? And maybe, I'm not talking about like, we don't have to have a Splunk board or something like that, but just the general idea of that kind of, let me run a query that says, I'm starting to see problems coming in or being introduced. How can I start querying for events to say, here's where it's coming from, and let's come up with standards that help us to reduce the likeliness that those things can be repeated?
We certainly don't have anything that I'm aware of on that front.
I'm not sure what the effort would be to set something like that up, or how we would decide on a standard for that. But if there's something, or maybe we could have some sort of other meeting to discuss some sort of specific solution ideas on how we can begin to aggregate the data around the problems so that we can start finding the solutions based on the data. Rather than what we were talking about before, where we hope that people just observe enough. Individuals observing individual events aren't going to be able to observe the entire pattern, because that's the whole issue with the maintenance, is that no one of us has the time to be everywhere at once. So some kind of aggregate place for us to be able to look at the bigger picture together as individuals. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, I'm also in Glenn Hinks' screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
anyways,
that sounds like a big effort. What I could see making sense just off the top of my head is acting as a focal point for where things could be reported. And then, so you can start to gather that data just from, if it's not all, as you said, none of us can be everywhere, but if there's somewhere people could say, oh, I've seen this. I don't know if that's like a first step we might think about taking.
I know a lot of times we do see things like that where multiple issues will be raised about a similar topic because people aren't observing the pattern. But yeah, we could maybe start out as a low effort solution to start out. Just kind of spending time, like having someone commit, maybe have like a Git issue to say, scrape the issues that we have and see if you observe a pattern of, problems, coming in. I'm not sure how, again, going back to the trust thing, I'm not sure who we could reliably, assign, or if anyone steps up to the plate, if they would actually know what the best course of action is for determining whether there's patterns. But yeah, like you said, having a place where people can go and look in the system that we already have would probably be the best starting point.
Right. Okay. So there was a few comments that, expanding security to the scope of this working group does overlap with what the security working group is already doing.
So that's what I'd had my hand raised about that.
Yeah.
Actually,
Okay. So
as well.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Basically, I think that so for example, tracking package ownership, that is exclusively an NPM concern. It would be great to be able to I don't know, put a list in your lock file of which publishers of a package you trust, and then it will warn you when you try to install a package from a new publisher or something. But that's something NPM has to deal with pretty exclusively. And then separately, if we're talking about restricting what packages can do from a security standpoint, that's something the security working group should be handling. And that's a really hard problem to solve in a way that keeps Node ergonomic. And but that's, I think, something, although I think the package maintenance group should be involved in those discussions and can make recommendations to the security group and to NPM. And I think they will be given their due weight. I think that's not something we should really focus on. It's not that it shouldn't be solved. It's that that makes consuming packages easier. That doesn't make maintaining them easier. Maintaining them is what the package maintenance group, I think, should be focusing on. And so I think, as has been echoed in the chat, finding ways to track changes for people and finding ways for maintainers to communicate to their consumers when ownership has changed, when that ownership, how trusted that ownership change is, things like that. Finding and then documenting best practices, as we've said. But I think that it's definitely going to distract our discussions if we focus on installing, which is an NPM concern, and security, which is the security group's concern.
Cool. Yeah, I was more thinking just having the option of having a place where I could get the information if I feel like it's pertinent for me maintaining a package. If I have the opportunity to at once solve a problem that the package maintainer needs solved and introduce some sort of improved security, just having access to that information in some place where I can assert that, I think would be beneficial, but I agree that we probably shouldn't build it within this team.
And if we have good ideas, we can coordinate with the security working group. I know that, in terms of the work that's going on that front too. But yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, we certainly we shouldn't, it's the example you had there of restricting what packages can do is clearly out of scope in my mind. It's that there are the best practices. If people follow the best practices, that does help security in some way, right? When handing over the packages. So there's going to be some sort of overlap / fuzzy line that we'll have to keep our eye on. Antonio has his hand up.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. My questions were around more clarification with the boundaries between the security group and package maintenance. I mean, I'm looking at it from a perspective of, if I'm going to include a package in my project, if I can be armed with more information about, hey, what's the probability, what's the likelihood that somebody that was authorized introduced some kind of malicious code into that package and now it's a dependency in my ecosystem? That's really where my security question was coming from. Not like security of the platform as a whole, but when it comes to trust, how do we, are there tools, is that part of our concern? Is that something we should try to corral information about? If there's a way to automate that, some kind of static analysis with remote repositories, if there is some vulnerability that can be picked up that way, would that be something that we would be concerned about as part of the information we want to surface to the Node Foundation for included dependencies? And if not, then does that matter, I guess? I guess that's where my question comes from for
right. That does sound like a good question to me. Like, do people think that it's in scope to, say, come up with the best practices for how you should select your dependencies? Which is, I think, part of what you just were, touching on, is like, when you select your dependencies, use these criteria, and you're more likely to, be choosing ones that are secure. Is that something that people think is reasonable within our scope, or not?
I don't think so. I think there's too much involved in that. There's a lot of factors, and those factors change all the time. I've been vetting the packages, and I get made fun of by most of my coworkers for being too rigorous about this, and it takes a lot of time, and I'm sure I miss things, and no maintainer following a best practice list is going to find things like a Bitcoin mining bug in her malicious code. It's just not reasonable to set out. I think this goes sort of with what Jordan was saying, with like limiting the scope to not be all things for all, let's really focus on what maintenance can be done. And if security help is a side effect, then great. But like trying to really nail down those kind of best practices is maybe not. I think the security working group would be better to define security best practices than we would be to define those kind of things.
I do think that there. Oh, sorry. Should I have raised my hand?
I think the only hand I see up is LJ Harb. So unless he wants to jump in.
That's from before. I'll lower it.
Okay, so go ahead.
Sorry. As a panelist, is there a way that I should be raising my hand just so I don't do that again?
There's a raise hand. I think if you go to participants, maybe.
On my iPhone app, it's under the ellipsis more menu. I don't know how it is on other interfaces.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyway, so just getting back to the comment from Wes earlier, do you think that people are worse off with a best practices sort of guide than they would be with it because they have a false sense of trust in the best practices guide? I'm just trying to figure out like whether producing a best practices guide would be a waste of our time or would improve the situation incrementally in some way. So I'm of the opinion that right now people just npm install anything and they don't really understand the cost of what it is to depend on another package, whether you're an application developer or a library author. And to put out, or at least started discussions that people are more aware that, hey, maybe they should look at least their direct dependencies and find out, are they running CI, and are they, do they have a process for handling security bugs? Do they have an LTS schedule? Things like that. I think seeding that information out into the community, while we can't provide absolute trust, but helping people understand what sort of tools they have at their disposal in order to gain trust on their own, I think that's still a productive one. And I think it can make a incremental improvement across the entire ecosystem, if not like a monumental improvement.
One other benefit of that approach, which I really like, is that it allows the community to, while we work on ways to report metrics that can be used for trust, it allows the community to kind of figure out what's worth trusting, because that's also a really hard decision to make in a general case.
So I was not trying to say that it is not worth the time. I think that if a group of people wanted to take that on, I think it would be productive and incremental. but I think that there are bigger things to focus on. And I think it just changes a lot. So that's why, you know, it'd just be a work to keep it up to date and relevant.
Okay. Just taking a few notes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it comes down to everybody's volunteers. So if people have a particular interest and say, for example, on that may be where they want to spend their time. And so it's a matter of picking out the, like, more than one, like, because there'll be different people who are interested in different areas, is picking out the 3, 4 that we think we can identify concrete next steps of what we want to get started on. We're down to 5 minutes. I think we've had a good kickoff discussion. The key thing I'd like to get to is, like, is there something that some agreement we can come to in terms of what do we want to do as a next step through GitHub before the next time that we get together? We have some broad areas. I think best practices in some form, makes sense to me. I don't know about everybody else, but, like, we could, for example, say, let's try and open an issue that says, let's list out the best practices that we think we should start on and prioritize which ones people want to work on. Or we could, say, let's get together and talk about what we think problems are. Or we could, what are the few things we think we want to get a conversation going on in GitHub, between now and the next meeting to make some progress on the different areas. See, there's a few hands up. Let me go to, so Benjamin has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify then on that security point. So for the event stream security issue, well, is that something that's going to be covered by package maintenance, or is that something going to be covered by the security working group, or is it something going to be covered by both? Because it's a bit confusing, because that was a package issue rather than like a Node core issue or one of the Node Foundation packages. So then if it's going to be covered by both groups and they're just going about it in different ways, that's fine. I'm just trying to find out are we considering event stream a security issue or a package maintenance issue?
Well, I think there's different aspects to it. Like, I think, and it's just my opinion, that the problem of, if you've got some packages, you can no longer maintain them, and you either want help to do that or want to find new owners. That seems like something that, this group should be involved in. It's not solving the actual security problem itself, but it's helping maintainers who were in the situation that ended up leading to that. Because I'm not sure, the security working group itself, it takes vulnerability reports, but I'm not sure, I don't think it or even this group is going to get involved in, like somebody else mentioned, is, tools that would have prevented that exploit from happening, so controlling what packages could do or anything like that. And I'll let the other, Antonio has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I wanted to ask the group also was, given that some of these things might be introduced through packages, these issues that can cause trouble, are we also considering, like, some kind of page, some kind of best practices information for when things can go wrong, things that should be looked at as a package maintainer that can be used in other things. When things go wrong, what should happen? What should protocol be for alerting people, for letting people know, like, things like that? Where does the strategy around that fit into our goals here?
I think that fits under the, like, best practices is a pretty broad area. The first step in my mind would be, like, identifying what we think are the best practices, or where people have expertise that they think they can, start writing something up that we could discuss and test with the community. Victor has his hand up as well.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. I wish to ask if there would be some, like, specific topic which a person interested in. For example, I'm interested in some, like, very specific topics, and I wish to include some more people in my, for example, group if it will be organized, and I don't know how to make it.
Right. So I guess, you know, you can open an issue on the repo saying, you know, this is an area of interest. You can add it in as something to discuss with this group, as, you know, here's something you think should be a priority. I guess I'd suggest opening an issue to start a discussion on those topics, or bringing them up now if they're, I guess we're out of time this time, but like bringing them up either in a meeting or in GitHub.
Thank you. I understand. I see. Thank
you. Wes, you still have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. You had said to wrap up what we're thinking of maybe good next steps.
Yep.
I would like to second, I think, taking both approaches. I can't remember who it was, Matteo and Jordan maybe, who brought up those two approaches to next steps. I think taking both of those in parallel would be a good idea. Defining some packages and some friendlies, I guess, as you put it, to start collaborating with. I'd like to volunteer the Express ecosystem. We have lots of problems that we'd love to have people come help solve. And then also identifying specifically our problems that we're going to try to come up with solutions. We've had a lot of issues open that are presenting solutions to problems, but we don't have anything that actually is like nailing down those problems. I think taking both of those steps in parallel would be a good next step.
Yeah, that actually sounds really good to me. I like, you know, something specific and then back to the bigger picture, what the problems are. Anybody have other thoughts on that? Like objections, counter thoughts? The only other thing and this comes to bandwidth, but like the sort of third thing I could see is we could start to think about best practices. If we have people who are interested in, and again, like I said, it comes down to what people are interested, but if people have a specific interest in that front, I think in parallel, we could start to say, let's put some shape to what that might be. And do that in parallel with the other two as well. Does anybody have things that they feel like, anybody object to those being sort of the three priorities that we start out with? So we define some key packages and the friendlies to go along with them. So, and I think Express is a perfect example. If you think that, Wes, you can sort of volunteer to represent that and get us started on that front. And then having okay, what are the general problems are we trying to solve? And then, you know, getting some work going on best practices. So I guess at this point, I'd ask, are there any volunteers to sort of want to open the issue for each of those three, get the discussion going? Not that you have to do all the work or whatever, but just to sort of kick it off. And I don't know, Wes, would you volunteer for starting the discussion on defining the key packages one?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Yeah.
Defining the problems, do we have anybody who wants to volunteer for that?
What would that entail, defining the problems? Like researching what the problems are and then defining them, or we have a list and I need to open up a ticket and
I think it's like we need to open an issue that says, you know, what are the key problems that module owners are currently facing that we want to help solve? And, you know, at the very first, you know, I think if there's already some ideas, like I think we have some ideas of what they might be, so we could capture some of those, but we want to open an issue to start people adding their thoughts on that. And then we, you know, sort of by volunteering, I'd also hope you could pull together some of the thoughts that people share into something. Often what we see is like a really long discussion, but if we can sort of pull that discussion into a few key paragraphs at the top of the issue that people can read and say, okay, this is the current state based on all the discussion. I think that's quite a useful way to move forward.
I see in the chat that Matteo Colina is saying that he wanted to pick that up. Just thank you for clarifying it.
Yeah. And then last one is around sort of getting best practices going. Anybody want to volunteer for that one?
And again, that would be like gathering, like opening up a ticket just for people to begin the conversation about best practices, or?
Yeah, it's kind of like maybe think a little bit about what some of them might be and say, let's put together our list and the ones we think are most important to work on and push forward. And maybe here's a list to think about. And then, like I said, it's the same kind of thing of, yeah, okay, here are all the individual comments and sort of trying to pull that into the, a sort of evolving issue, content at the top of the issue that shows where we're at. And then, we can use that to, once it gets to a state where we say, okay, that makes enough sense to everybody, how do we actually start on the individual ones?
As a first-time contributor, that sounds like an intimidating task, but I'm willing to help out with it. But I don't know about taking it on my own and just kind of like writing out a bullet list of best practices for, this is an issue that would be opened on Express or on the package maintainers?
Oh, it would be in this package maintenance repo. It's like for this working group to use to say, okay, what are the best practices? How should we validate that these are useful ones, that kind of stuff.
And if you take it on, I think you should be careful not to take on, you don't have to define them all yourself.
No.
It would just be the steward of the conversation.
Curation. Yeah, no, so if you're a little bit worried, maybe I'll take that on with you.
Excellent.
So if you want to do that, and I'll put both of our names against it, so I'll make sure that I jump in and help out whenever needed, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm online pretty much all day, so I'm sure I'll be able to steward the conversation and kind of keep it going. But yeah, just generally setting down the baseline for the conversation as a first-time contributor. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. So yeah, working with you on that would be great.
Okay, so yeah, why don't we can sort of touch base offline and do that.
Excellent.
Thank you. I do see a couple hands. Victor has his hand up. Is that?
Yeah, about the last point, there can be different best practices for different packages.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Like there might be different categories. So we're not going to be like telling any package maintainer what they should do, and
should we open an issue, for example, for database packages or streams packages, or how?
I don't know yet whether they're different enough to warrant, like, I think I'd have to have a better understanding of what the best practices might be to know whether they're different for each of those. So for example, the one I can think of is like, sort of a long-term support process or whatever. Is that going to be different based on the type of package? Or, if, the use of Semver or whatever, for me, at least, we'd need more, figuring out more thought or sort of structure before I dive into like, is it different for different types of packages?
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So the other question is talking about membership in terms of, so from I can't see who that's from. Richard.
That was me. Sorry.
Rick, okay. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. So yeah, I was just curious because I'm just noticing a ton of open PRs, myself included, about adding to and we kind of touched on it earlier in the topics, and then we went down to about everything else, which is also vitally important. But more in general, I know we had about 20 starting people in the chat just now, but as we said, we want to kind of deviate like what is for the core group of who's got the votes, who's just here to observe and work, etc. Are we going to touch upon that in the next meeting, or is that something we want to just put as a part of the next notes?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're out of time today. I think that the model we started with was, everybody who's shown an interest is basically joining in. In terms of I think we should almost just like open an issue where we can have some discussion around that and see what people think. I think like Matteo was saying, there's not going to be as much contention in this particular meeting, that there's very specific context around and technical context around the modules. So I'm not as worried in terms of, saying, okay, well, you can join. If we get to the point where we have to start resolving conflict, we can become more formal, but I tend towards, not going there unless we have to. Right. I do think the point though about like subdividing into subgroups and stuff like that, opening an issue to kind of start a discussion there to say, okay, we've got a really large group of people, which is great. Obviously, a meeting of 100 people doesn't make a lot of sense. How do we sort of subdivide the different areas of where people are interested? So for example, if we've said these first 3 things are where we're going to focus on, we can start out by taking a poll to see of the people who've shown interest, where do their interests align or not. Maybe there's some other area we need to start to do in parallel as well, because 50% of the people don't have any interest in those 3 and want to do something else.
Yep, that makes sense. And that's why I just brought it up to see if we're going to put that on the next week's agenda and whatnot to discuss further, because I know we're way past time now.
Yeah. I'll throw something in there to have a discussion on that front and push that forward. It's a good point.
Thank you.
I will say I'm not sure about next week. I think the next couple of weeks are like holidays for many people.
Yes, I meant the next meeting.
The next meeting, yeah. So I think the next meeting, my proposal, unless anybody objects, would be for like early in the new year.
Second that.
Okay, and then and Benjamin's even asking about weekly. I think we might start it weekly to kick off. Often, in the community, they're like every 2 or 3 weeks. But in sort of the bootstrap stage, I suspect maybe we want to do them a little bit more often to start. Does that sound right to people?
Makes sense.
Okay, and Antonio, your hand's up.
Yeah, I was hoping to get added to you and Edgar to help out with the moderating of that best practices. I want to volunteer for that.
Okay, so maybe could both of you send me an email? Here, I'll send you mine. Yeah. I'm just pasting it in the chat. If you can both send me an email, then I'll set something up so that we can sync on that.
Thank you.
Oh, I said that privately, not what I meant to do. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, you did send that to me.
Yeah, but I wanted to send it also to Victor, so.
Got it. So email you. I'm sorry, I was distracted from Slack.
Yeah, so if you can both just send me an email, that way I'll have your emails and can connect everybody up together.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's great. Thanks for everybody for taking the time. And I see somebody threw a nice picture into the Q&A. We're over time. Let's just do a very quick look to see if there's anything in the chat for the YouTube. Sorry, I'm just... Okay. There we go. So I see a few comments. Okay. Okay, I think most of the comments seem to be people, a couple of people talking to themselves. Good idea, focus on a little set of package in order to find the practical problems, right? I think, which is what Mateo and Wes had called out. And he already has an answer. Okay, so I think we will call it a day for this week. Hopefully everybody will be active in GitHub, and we'll get issues open to start working on those 3 particular areas and push it forward from there.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Talk to everybody later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.